What did you think of the show yesterday?
I always enjoy the Calgary Easter Show because there's a lot of historical displays, and that's really kind of my thing. And because it's such a big event, there's also a lot of people there that I don't get to see very often. I don't get around to do much shopping, but usually I've arranged ahead of time for a few things to be delivered to me, and so I did pick up at least 3 interesting items there. I had been waiting for over 3 years for the feds to approve the transfer of a 12.3 converted automatic Beretta 3844, and that was delivered to me very kindly by the major auction house back east. Then I had a gentleman who brought a couple of Japanese flare guns for me to take a look at, and one of them was one I needed, which was a Japanese Type 90 double-barreled flare gun, first variation. So I picked that up, and then one of the smaller auction houses in Alberta had sold me a Japanese training rifle, and it was delivered to me at the show. So even though I didn't get to go around and buy anything, I still came away with a few interesting additions to my collection.
The Alberta CFO booth seemed to attract a lot of attention. What kind of questions were people asking you?
People were very concerned about what the election might bring, and a lot of them wanted to know what the government of Alberta was going to do to help protect them against the federal government's actions. Surprisingly, a lot of them were not aware of many of the things that we've already done.
Why do you think there's such a concern?
The federal government and anti-gun groups continue to use divisive and misleading language to describe this issue. And then the mainstream media pick up that divisive language, and that becomes the narrative that the public sees. Sadly, the mainstream media don't appear to have the knowledge to do the meaningful fact-checking that would be required to present an accurate picture of what's going on.
What do you mean?
Well, there are some claims that are just completely false, and others that are red herrings, meaning that they distract from the main issue. So, for example, in Chapter 3 of the federal government's fall economic statement, they claim that this measure, the gun grab or buyback, as they like to refer to it, that this measure is explicitly designed to target only assault weapons, and yet the list of firearms that they are currently trying to collect from dealers includes many bolt-action rifles, single-shot rifles, break-action firearms. In fact, the largest or the most expensive item on the list is that they're going to use $117,450 of your tax dollars for every Purdy double rifle that is surrendered. And this is just a staggering waste of resources, since obviously these kind of custom-made, purpose-built sporting firearms are highly unlikely to ever figure in any kind of a crime. The idea of this is so absurd, the waste is absolutely staggering. They also make a big deal of the fact that they want to get rid of weapons of war because they're allegedly unsuitable for hunting. But Canadians have been using Army surplus rifles for over 100 years for hunting purposes. Originally, perhaps Snyder rifles that had been cut down and sporterized, and nowadays, of course, it's much more likely to be a World War I or World War II vintage Lee Enfield 303, probably the most common hunting rifle in Canada. This is a very dangerous line of reasoning. Almost every type of firearm has been used for some specialized military purpose at one time or another. For example, bolt-action rifles of commercial manufacture have been used frequently for sniper rifles. Almost every type of pump-action shotgun has been used at some time by some military for riot control or guard purposes, or in actual combat in close quarters. So the mere fact that something has been used by a military, that if you use that as a criteria, you would essentially disqualify virtually every firearm from possible use by civilians.
What concerns you most about this line of reasoning?
Well, the federal government's agenda seems to be to try to narrow the range of activities that the public considers legitimate. So, broadly speaking, there are four main reasons that are traditionally acceptable for firearms ownership in Canada. Hunting is certainly one of them, but there's also target shooting, collecting, and occupational use of firearms. So, but the federal government is trying to create this narrative that the only legitimate reason for owning a firearm is hunting, and that the only firearms that it's legitimate to use for that one legitimate purpose are the ones that some bureaucrat in Ottawa has decided are suitable for that purpose. Hunting is certainly important, but in Alberta, for example, less than half of people who have a firearms license have a hunting license. So clearly, there are many other reasons for firearms ownership that are perfectly legal, perfectly valid, and that have long been accepted and legally recognized.
Why is it important to defend these other reasons for firearms ownership?
Target shooting is a very diverse group of sports, encompassing everything from clay pigeon disciplines to IPSC, PPC, USDPA, steel challenge, cowboy action, mounted cowboy shooting, long-distance precision rifle, biathlon, the various Olympic disciplines, and many more besides. These are sports where men and women can compete together, and they often encourage family participation. They're extremely safety-oriented. Participating in them is among the best ways to inculcate a culture of safety and responsibility among new firearms owners. Yet the federal government has been attacking almost every type of firearm used in the most popular sports.
What about collecting?
So many firearms are irreplaceable historical artifacts. Collectors are the ones who preserve these precious pieces of history. Collectors use their guns to tell the stories of our past. Lots of people who would never pick up a thick reference book about World War II, for example, are fascinated to see an actual item that was part of that conflict, whether it's a Tommy gun or one of the many different types of bolt-action rifles used by most of the belligerents in that conflict. And if they get a chance to shoot one of these pieces of history, it's something they won't soon forget. Militaries around the world, including in Canada, recognize the importance of military history as a means of stimulating interest in the younger generation to serve in the defense of their country. Museums can't do it all, though. Their collections are often lacking pieces that private collectors have. I myself have loaned several of my firearms to museums at various times because it filled gaps in a particular historical display that they wanted to do. There is also a lot of interest in Canada's civilian history with firearms. Anti-gun activists like to make out that firearms are somehow an aspect of the Americanization of Canadian culture, but nothing could be further from the truth. I proudly display a photo of my grandfather shooting a handgun at an indoor range in the 1950s, and my father's handgun and machine gun registration certificates from the 1960s. Family lore has it that my great-grandfather bought a Colt shortly after coming to Canada in the early 1900s. I still own several of the firearms that have been in my family for generations. Firearms are as Canadian as maple syrup and as Albertan as beef.
You mentioned occupational use. That's something most people don't usually think about.
Occupational use is actually a big part of firearms ownership out here in Alberta. Most ranches and farms have some firearms they use as tools to control pests and predators. Trapping is still an important part of life, particularly in many northern communities, and trappers often need firearms for humane dispatch. We still have a lot of people who work in resource industries where firearms are needed to protect them from predators. We have lots of cougars and grizzly bears out here. Outfitting is a big business. Particularly, it supports the rural economy in many areas. And many members of the military and police forces acquire firearms so that they can get the extra practice that they feel they need in order to maintain peak proficiency with their firearms.
Hunting is still a big part of the reason for firearms ownership, though, isn't it?
Well, hunting, of course, is still probably half of the firearms ownership in Alberta. But it's really important to look at the firearms community as a whole. You can't separate these various motivations because the firearms community is an ecosystem. You take one part out and it often has major repercussions for the other parts. So handgun owners play an outsized role in the firearms community. Although they're relatively small in number, they are one of the main people who tend to support ranges and businesses because you can only generally use handguns on an approved range, and handgun owners tend to shoot a lot more than people who are involved in hunting, for example. So that means they need to buy more ammunition, more reloading supplies, and so on. So if you end handgun ownership, then you're going to threaten the continued existence of ranges, which then means there's no place for hunters to go and sight in their rifles and practice, and businesses will suffer and may go under, which means then there's no place for hunters and others to acquire ammunition and obtain gunsmithing services and all of the other things that businesses provide to the firearms community. So many people also have multiple roles. So they may be a hunter or a target shooter when they're younger and then gradually shift to collecting. You also have to consider confidence in the system. All the changes that have been introduced recently have had a major negative impact on the confidence of Canadian firearms owners in the fairness of the firearms control system. And that really is a crucial aspect of any regulatory system. If you do not have the confidence of the people that you are regulating, the system is doomed.
Many people feel that the changes now being introduced infringe on their rights.
The question of rights as it relates to firearms ownership is a thorny one best left to constitutional lawyers. Personally, I don't think governments give us rights. We either have rights because we're human or because God gave us those rights, depending on your religious perspective. But what governments do is they can acknowledge or protect or violate our rights. And even when there is an acknowledged constitutional right to firearms ownership, as there is in the United States and in Mexico, that has not prevented some really awful firearms laws from being adopted. Whether we have a right to own firearms or not, we do have a right to be treated fairly. And by that standard, many of the current changes fail miserably. Le grand homme d'État français, Georges Clemenceau, a dit dans son discours au Sénat en 1917 que le gouvernement a pour mission de faire que les bons citoyens soient tranquilles et que les mauvais ne le soient pas. What that means is that, I'll just say it in English now, so the great French statesman Georges Clemenceau said in his speech about the war to the Senate of France in 1917 that the mission of government is to make sure that good citizens can rest easy and bad ones cannot. And unfortunately, our current government has been doing exactly the opposite. Punishing the innocent will never deter the guilty. We need confidence-building measures. We need to rebuild the trust between firearms owners and the regulatory system.
How do we do that?
It will take time and a lot of effort because of how badly confidence has been shaken by what the federal government has done recently. The first thing the federal government has to do is to immediately freeze its plans to confiscate the lawfully acquired property of law-abiding Canadians. This is essential. It's only the first step, but as they say, when you're in a hole, the first thing to do to get out is to stop digging. Ideally, the federal government would abandon this plan entirely, but depending on who gets elected, that might be too much to expect immediately. There is no way that the current confiscation plan can be carried out in the time frames that are anticipated. Every gun show that I attend, I have dozens of people come up to me with correspondence they've received from the federal government about this confiscation scheme. And the most common reaction they have is they have no idea of what it means, or if they think they know what it means, they're wrong. They think it means something that it does not mean. Very often, I've had people come up to me and say, does this mean I can't take my handguns to the range anymore? That is not what their letters say. I've had people spend an hour to go home and get the letter and bring it back to me to tell them what it means. This is not because these people are in any way deficient in their knowledge of the English language. It's because the people who are writing this are not being clear. And so it's essential that we start over again in the communication about what is going on, end this practice of confusing and misleading communication, and communicate clearly to people what is happening and give them a reasonable time frame to bring themselves into compliance. If we really should be just abandoning this entire project altogether. But if we're not going to abandon it, then at the very least, people need to be communicated with clearly so that they understand what's going on and can guide themselves accordingly. There's one statement that the federal government has made recently about the firearms control scheme that is actually true, but their remedy for it would be a complete disaster. The part that's actually true is that our classification scheme for firearms is needlessly complex. You shouldn't need anything other than a tape measure to determine the classification of a firearm. The problem is that they propose to appoint a committee to review this classification scheme. And I do not believe that any classification scheme proposed by a committee appointed by the current government would accurately reflect any element of public safety. And in fact, this would simply turn into an exercise of how do we find out ways to prohibit more firearms. So we do need to simplify the classification scheme, but we need to, if it's going to be done, it needs to be done by people who know what they are doing, and that means not just understanding firearms, but understanding the firearms community and appreciating them, not looking down their noses at them the way that these Ottawa mandarins and big city media types do.
It sounds like this is something you'd like to sink your teeth into.
Well, I've made it my mission in life to help Canada to get an effective and just firearms control system. Different people and organizations can be good at different roles as we work towards this goal. We need to work together and avoid friendly fire. My temperament may perhaps help. I do get angry when I see some of the claptrap that passes for analysis of this issue, but that anger passes quickly, because I try to convert it into motivation for action. I used to be more frustrated, but now that I have this job, I try, there's always something I can do, some action, no matter how small, that I can take that I think is going to move things ahead to some extent. There are people who want to give up, who want to go to the United States. I can't blame these people, given the intense attacks that the firearms community has been subjected to. But that's not me. This is my country. These are my traditions. This is my community. I can't run away. I'm going to fight to the bitter end. But what does that mean? It means using whatever skills, talents, abilities I have developed to bring people together, to bring the firearms community together, and to bring the non-firearms community and the firearms community together, because we share one goal, and that is public safety. Everybody wants Canada to be a safe country, and the only way we can do that is if we have a firearms control system that is targeted at wrongdoers, that supports the ecosystem of law-abiding firearms owners to continue in their peaceful, law-abiding activities, that is going to sustain this community in such a way that as new people come in, they are socialized into the responsible traditions that have been a part of Canadian firearms ownership for as long as there have been firearms owners in Canada. In order to do this, I've been trying to develop the skills that I need. I do a lot of interviews in both English and French, and over time, I'm getting a little bit better at it. I'm fortunate that I was able to meet many of the giants of the firearms community back in the day. I knew people like Dave Tomlinson and Ray Laycock of the NFA, Howie Desereau, and Hank Holm of the Alberta Arms and Cartridge Collectors Association. People who were key leaders in the firearms community in the decades that I have belonged to it. And many of these people were good friends of mine. I went to full auto shoots and shot the machine guns of Dave Tomlinson. Dave Tomlinson gave me a Japanese Type 94 pistol as a gift. He thought it would be better with me than with him. This is the kind of selfless generosity that is very common in the firearms community and can be an example for all of Canada. I may never reach their stature, but I'm determined to carry on the fight and at some point to pass on the torch to a new generation who will carry firearms ownership many decades, hopefully centuries, into the future of this great country. I've still got a lot of fight left in me.